Thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for those stirring remarks. You began the speech, and you ended the speech with President Johnson's famous words, "Let us continue." And when he made that speech, he also pressed for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to be passed by a reluctant Congress. You were in your mid-teens, or your early teens, when you heard that speech. What was your reaction when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed?
Yeah, I was in my early teens. I was about 13 or so. And I don't think I fully understood the significance of what had occurred, though I knew it was important, certainly because my father told me that it was. But I did have a sense that there was something happening. I mean, I had the opportunity to view from New York City, where I was born and raised, all that was going on in the South at that time. Saw many of the leaders who were responsible for the change and the activity in the South standing behind the president as he was prepared to sign that important legislation, and understood that something significant, something transformative had actually occurred. It was interesting as we looked at the pictures here earlier. I noticed that one of the people behind the president as he was signing the legislation was my late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone, a young woman who in 1963 integrated the University of Alabama when George Wallace stood in the door. I had not realized that Vivian was there for that. And so on any number of levels, it was for me then something that I knew to be important, and as I said, transformative, and have come to realize over the years that it really changed what this nation was, and made it possible for a young black guy from Queens in New York to be the 82nd Attorney General of the United States of America.
Yeah. Note to the staff, we have to get the Attorney General a copy of that picture.
Or you'll have to deal with Sharon Malone, my wife.
When you were nominated to this post, you talked about one of your priorities being the reinvigorization of the Civil Rights Division. Why so? Why did you feel that in 2009?
Because the health of a United States Department of Justice, I think, can be measured by the vitality of its Civil Rights Division. Our division is led by a very capable, able, unbelievably energetic young guy named Tom Perez, and who's done a wonderful job. I thought that, quite frankly, the department had lost its way, that we had lost some of the spirit that moved President Johnson to against great political odds. And people have to understand that. What he did in getting the 64 Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, was really difficult, extremely, extremely difficult. He made unlikely allies. And that spirit needs to be a part of our Civil Rights Division. And I thought that we had kind of lost our way. And it seemed to me that as part of the legacy of this Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, I wanted people 20, 30 years from now to look back and say, these were folks who cared about civil rights. They cared about making sure that this nation was true to its founding ideals. And that's the part of the Justice Department that has that responsibility, to make sure that we provide equal opportunity for people, that people are treated fairly, that we give everybody just a fair shake. And as I said, I'm proud of the work that's being done by our Civil Rights Division, though we have more work to do.
One of the things that seems to have changed, Mr. Attorney General, between the time when Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act and today is there's not a spirit of bipartisanship. There were members reaching across the aisle at that time to get things done, to move this country ahead. That spirit seems to be lacking in Washington today. You and I were talking backstage about the divisions that you see there. You've been in Washington since pre-Watergate, since 1973. Why have things become so divided in Washington?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I really have the answer. I've talked to people who served in Congress many years ago. One of the things they talk about is that Congress only sits now from Tuesday to Thursday, and then everybody goes home. That in the old days, people lived next to one another. They knew each other beyond just what happened on the floor of the Senate, the floor of the House. And it's hard to demonize somebody that you know. It's hard to demonize a person who is your neighbor. It's easier, I think, to interact with somebody who you know outside the workplace. So I think that's at least one of the reasons. There are other concerns I have with regard to the extremes in parties leading parties in different directions. There is a notion, I think, that somehow or other you cannot be a person of principle if you compromise. And from my perspective, there is not a tension between those two. You can be a person of principle. You can have strong beliefs, and you can still compromise. It's how the best legislation that we've passed came about. And I hope that in the near future, and hopefully after the next election, if not before, that spirit will be rekindled. We have pressing problems in this country. We have urgent needs that have to be dealt with. And time is a wasting. So I would hope that the American people will keep this in mind as they exercise their right to vote next year and choose leaders, choose representatives who will have that spirit that Lyndon Johnson embodied and the men that he and women he worked with back in the 60s.
Do you see any hope of that divide being repaired after the election? Is there any reason for optimism?
I am always optimistic. My wife says I am ridiculously idealistic, but I could not live any other way. I mean, I think that given the magnitude of the issues that we confront, the seriousness of the problems that we have, that more than anything will make patriotic Americans, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, come together for the benefit of the people they represent, for the good of this country, and do so in a way that's consistent with our founding principles and consistent with the way in which people in Congress have conducted themselves for hundreds of years. So I remain optimistic.
Going back to the Voting Rights Act for a moment, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized overwhelmingly by Congress in 2006 under George W. Bush's presidency. But 5 years later, the constitutionality of Section 5, which you mentioned in your speech, is being questioned. What is Section 5, and why do you believe it needs to be to remain intact?
Well, Section 5, as indicated in my speech, deals with 16 states or parts of 16 states where there has been a finding of a history of discrimination and where there is the need for a desire to make any kind of voting change. Pre-clearance has to happen either at the Justice Department or in the District Court in Washington, D.C. I'd like to be in a place where we could say that the need for Section 5 was not there anymore. But I think the reality, given some of the examples that I used in the speech and others that you can easily find, shows that discrimination, subtle forms, overt forms, still exists, and that there is a need for the continued vitality of the Voting Rights Act generally, Section 5 in particular, Section 2 as well. These are tools that we need to have at the Justice Department, at this Justice Department, and successor Justice Departments, just as they were needed in Justice Departments before this one, to ensure that everyone has the right to the ballot, which I think is, as President Johnson said, the most important right that we have. I mean, when you look at all that's going on in the world in the recent past, if you remember the people in Iraq holding up their thumbs, the purple mark on there, it was about them having the right to vote. The Arab Spring, well, again, all about the right to vote, to be a participant in the direction of your country. Most recently, I guess what we've seen in Russia, people demonstrating because they thought an election was conducted in a fraudulent way. This right to vote, this notion, this desire to be able to vote freely and without any kind of fraud or coercion is really kind of almost basic, and it's something that we have done well in the United States by constantly expanding the number of people who will have the opportunity to vote. And I'm concerned about some of the legislation that has been passed recently that goes against, as I call it, that arc of history, and it's tending to restrict in ways that are subtle and sometimes not so subtle the ability of the American people to cast their ballots.